dears, and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and today I've got another book talk video to share with you guys. And today we are talking about The Cactus by Sarah Haywood. Now, honestly, I picked this book up because I was kind of looking for just a nice, light summer read. And the cover of this screamed that at me. And it was kind of that. And another thing here in the little corner blurb, it says, fans of Eleanor Oliphant is completely fine, will love The Cactus. And I really liked that book. If you remember, I did a book talk on it almost a year ago because I got that book at the Dublin airport when I was headed home from Ireland last summer. So that intrigued me as well because I did love that book. So let's talk a little bit about The Cactus. Our main character in this book is a woman named Susan Green, and the reason that the similarities will be drawn between Susan and Eleanor is that their personalities are definitely a little similar. They have very rigid rules for their lives. They're very put together. They're very no nonsense. You know, they wear sensible clothes. They make sensible decisions. They don't rush into anything. Everything is very, very carefully planned out. Now, the one big difference between Eleanor and Susan is that at the beginning of The Cactus, we learn that Susan's pregnant. And it becomes very clear very quickly, bless you, Trixie, my dog is sneezing. It became very clear very quickly that this was not part of Susan's plan. And in fact, she doesn't even have a serious boyfriend or anything like that. In fact, 13 years ago, because at the point where we meet Susan, she's 45 years old. 13 years prior, she had answered a personal ad in a newspaper for a man who was looking for a kind of no strings attached companion. And when she read the ad, she really saw herself in it. You know, the way the man was describing his circumstances was kind of the way she felt about her own. And she was right. They got together and they really hit it off. They had a ton in common. And for 13 years, they fulfilled in each other that sort of need for companionship and intimacy without having to get tangled up in a serious relationship. Because for Susan, the thought of having to share a life with someone, like a home and just a life in general, that did not sound appealing to her in the slightest because it would interrupt the flow of everything she set up for her very rigid life. And Richard, who was the man who she was seeing, very much felt the same way. But now at 45, she finds herself pregnant. So at first she thinks she is not going to tell him. He doesn't need to know because then he might want to be a part of the life of the child, and she doesn't want that. So that's where her mindset kind of is when we first meet her at the beginning of the book. We also learn that very recently, in fact, in the first page, we learn that on the first page, we learn that Susan's mother has just passed away and her brother Edward is calling to tell her the news. And now Edward and Susan, we quickly pick up, have had a very tumultuous relationship. He's the exact opposite of Susan. He's very nonchalant, very laid back, very much take things as they come. And that's led him to not really having a stable life and a stable existence just in general. And those are all qualities that Susan really, really doesn't care for. So with the passing of her mother, we get some flashbacks to when Susan and Edward were children. We learn that their father passed away years ago. He had been a bad alcoholic, and eventually it just got the best of him and he passed away. And now their mother, who was quite older because, like I said, Susan herself is 45 years old. Edward's 2 years younger, so that would put him at 43. So, you know, her mom, we learn, was in her 30s when they were born. So she's, you know, in her 70s, probably late 70s. She's getting on in years. And it was a stroke that took her. So the will is read. And that's where things really start to go south. Because first of all, the fact that their mother had a will is shocking to Susan. She didn't really think her mom was that kind of person. And she knew her mother up until very recently hadn't had one. And so it's weird to her that she had just kind of out of the blue had one drawn up a few months before she died. And then the will is read and everything becomes even more suspicious in that what Eleanor figured would be a split in the estate, half going to her and half going to her brother, actually turns out to be that the house has been left to him entirely, and that when he dies or decides to sell it, whichever comes first, then the cost, like the money that they make in the sale will be split between the two of them. But that's up to him if he, you know. So if he dies before they sell the house, then of course she would get it all, but it's left to him to figure out what to do with it. And this completely shakes her. And she's having a really difficult time believing that her mother would have done that. And she starts to wonder if, because her mother had 2 small strokes before she had the big stroke that finally took her, Susan starts to wonder if maybe she wasn't in her right mind and that maybe Edward had kind of pushed the will on her. Because like I said, there had never been a will before. So then comes time for the funeral and Susan makes the trek back to their hometown. She gets back to their family home and she's really distressed right off the bat to see that already, even though their mother is newly deceased, she's very stressed to see that already Edward's taking over the house like it's his, because in her mind she's like, I'm gonna fight this and I'm gonna make it so he has to sell it and give me half because I'm having a baby, I need my inheritance. She wanted to buy an apartment and all this, and she's really mad. So when she gets to the home, she walks in, but Edward's not there when she gets there. Instead, his friend Rob is there. And she doesn't recognize Rob. And he's like, oh, you don't recognize me? Like we met back when we were all in college? She's like, nope, never heard of ya. And so she's suspicious of Rob right off the bat. She figures that he's probably co-conspiring with her brother to get this house. And it's just this whole thing. She's just very wary of everybody, because one thing we learn about Susan as it goes on is she is so closed off from everybody. She doesn't trust anybody. She doesn't let anybody near her. So as time goes by, her brother comes home, there's bickering, there's fighting. And we don't really know why there's so much fighting. We don't, you know, obviously they're very different, but it seems like there's more to it than that. And it takes a long time before we figure out kind of what's the underlying thing that is just driving her insane about Edward. And we find out later that it has to do with a man named Philip, who was her ex-fiance back when they were young and in college. We'll get to that later. So meanwhile, you know, she's dealing with the whole pregnancy thing while all of this is going on. So she goes back to London where she lives. So she finally decides that she's going to get in touch with Richard, who's the baby's father, and tell him that she's pregnant. But she's going to do it in such a way that really sets up a business arrangement for this baby like they had with their, you know, intimate, more personal relationship. So she tells him, she says, you know, we can set up a schedule every month. I will tally up how much the baby costs. I will give you a price, like 50%. I'll let you know the amount that you owe. You can pay that 50%, not a penny more. And he was like, well, what about if we get married? Would that work? And she's like, no, that would not work. I don't want that. And it's all, both of their exchanges, like they're so similar in the way they talk and the way they think and the way they act. So he thinks this business arrangement idea is great. She thinks it's great. He offers to marry her. She says, nah, that's not necessary. I don't really want that. So they're really, you know, they're working it out in a way that makes sense for these two very strange people. So kind of that's all taken care of in that area. So then eventually Susan goes back to her hometown because Rob has called her and he says, your brother wants you to come home and help clear out the house. He's not going to be here when you do it because he's having a really difficult time. And she's like, oh, he's having a really difficult time, is he? And Rob's like, yeah, he's having a difficult time, so he's not going to be here because he doesn't want to fight with you. So you come, do what you need to do. I'll be here. And at this point, Susan is still very suspect of Rob, and she's like, oh, great. But then she's kind of like, no, that will work, because she's gotten it in her head that she's going to take Edward to court for the house. She wants the will amended. She wants to prove that her mother wasn't in her right mind when she wrote the will. And she wants to prove that, like, the strokes really took a toll on her mental health and her mental state in general. So she thinks if she can go and kind of try to coax some info out of Rob, maybe he could slip up and say something about how Edward had forced their mom somehow to drop the will. She also decided she's going to speak to her aunt, her mother's sister, her Aunt Sylvia. She's not really close with her Aunt Sylvia, but she figures, you know, it's someone who might know something. She decides to get the medical records, to talk to the neighbors. She also decides to talk to her mother's vicar at the church because she thinks maybe he'll know something. And for the most part, most people seem to think, you know, she was fine. Might have never went back to 100% how she was before the strokes, but, you know, for the most part, she was fine. She didn't seem to have, you know, lapsed in her mental faculties at all. And when she's talking to the vicar, she really gets the sense that he's not telling her everything that he knows. And in fact, at one point, he tells her, you know, it's really difficult for me trying to think of what I can tell you that your mother told me that, you know, she wouldn't mind me telling you after her passing. I don't want to break her trust, even though she's gone. You know, I want to keep the things she would have kept private. And Susan's kind of like, okay, well, she's gone now. It's like, anything you could do to help me would be great. But he doesn't, he wants to take, you know, time and think about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you now, if you like the sound of this and you want to read it, now's the time to click away and don't listen to any of the spoilers. I will say it's a good book. I enjoyed it. The twist at the end actually took me by surprise, and that's always something I love in a book. And if you like, you know, family drama, there's definitely that there. It's a very charming story about love and family and learning to open up and learning to trust. And if that sounds like something you'd like, then definitely give it a go. Now, for those of you that do want spoilers, let's carry on. So we soon find out through a flashback about Susan's ex-fiance. Trixie can hear the neighbors outside, and now she's growling. So we soon get a flashback from Susan as to what happened with her ex-fiance, Phil. So we learned that Phil was very much like Susan, very studious, very serious, very no-nonsense, and she really loved him. And he asked her to marry him, and kind of despite herself, she said yes. And she was so excited about it. But soon after, Phil became friends with Edward, which, you know, in a normal circumstances would be great. You know, your fiance and your brother becoming friends. But Susan hated it because Edward wasn't the kind of person she wanted Phil spending time with. You know, he drank and smoked pot and just all the things she didn't want for Phil. But he spent a bit of time with them when she was out of town, and they really kind of formed a bond. And then one day he told her that he was going hiking with Edward, and he never came back. There was an accident while they were out, and Phil had wandered off to take pictures kind of away from the group because it was a big group of them out there, and he fell to his death. And after he fell, Edward, you know, they caught sight of him, and Edward tried to go down the hill to find him, but Edward ends up lost. And so after the helicopter found Phil's body, they had to go and find Edward and his friend who had gotten lost, and it was a whole thing. And, you know, Susan really blames him for Phil's death. There's at one point where she says, you know, I don't think he killed him on purpose. So even just wording it like that really shows you how much of a grudge Susan holds towards Edward about that. And she really, really blames him for what happened to Phil. But as time is going on, she's getting the house packed up. She's moving forward with the case against Edward, trying to get her share of her inheritance now instead of later. Her and Rob actually began to develop a really close, really special friendship. They spend more and more time together. Eventually he has a falling out with Edward, which it's never really laid out entirely, but you get the impression that it has to do with Rob spending time with Susan and Edward not liking that. But yeah, they just develop a really close friendship, and it's beautiful, and it starts blossoming into something more. Anyway, eventually the vicar calls Susan back and he says, okay, you know what? I've decided that I do need to tell you what your mother told me. I think it could be important for you personally in your life and in your future, and I need you to come and I need to tell it to you in person. She's like, I live 100 kilometers away. He's like, I know, but can you please just come here? Later that week she goes and she talks to him, and Rob picks her up at the train station when she arrives in town and drives her to the church. Anyway, so she goes in and talks to the vicar. She comes out and she is rattled because what the vicar has told her is that she was adopted, that her mother wasn't her birth mother. And she says, what? Like, she's completely taken off guard. And he says, go and look at your birth certificate. And she's like, I don't have my birth certificate. I've never needed it. I don't have a license. I don't have a passport. My mom said she lost it, so I never really ordered a new one or anything. And he says, well, go and try to find it. She told me that she put it in the lining of her jewelry box. And it kind of clicks for Susan because she knows that she has her mother's jewelry box. She took it from the house when she was cleaning out the rooms. She calls her friend who lives in the above apartment in her building, and she gets her to go down and let herself in and go to the jewelry box and read the birth certificate, and she does. So where the name for the father is supposed to be, it's blank. But where the name for the mother is, it's her Aunt Sylvia. So she is mortified. She goes to Rob. She asks to be driven to Sylvia's house and dropped off. She goes in and she kind of confronts Sylvia and says, listen, and she's just like, I know. And Sylvia's like, oh, what do you know? She's like, that I was adopted and that you're my mother, and I want to hear it from you. And so Sylvia goes on to tell her that she was 17 years old, that she wasn't fit to be a mother at 17, that her sister was 30 years old at the time and was having trouble conceiving, and she thought the two would be a good fit. That way she'd get to keep the baby in her life as a niece, and her sister would be able to be a mother. And as she's telling this to Susan, none of it's really, Susan doesn't care. She's mad. And, you know, as a third party reading it, we can be like, that does make sense. But of course, if it's your own life and your own family, she's very upset, as you would be. And she just can't see Sylvia's side of things at all. Then she goes on to ask who the father is. And she learns that one night after a wedding, the man who she thought was her father drove her Aunt Sylvia home. And one thing led to another, and they ended up having a brief one-night stand affair. So who Susan thought was her father was her father. It's just her mother that wasn't her mother. And she's just horrified by all of that news. So she storms off, she leaves immediately, and she's very upset. And again, she can't see things from Sylvia's point. She can't understand it. And she begins to look back at her childhood, and a lot of things that didn't make sense start to make sense. And, you know, she had felt that her mother really favored her brother, and she couldn't understand it, but now it made a little more sense to her. So then finally she takes a bit of time and really puts some thought into it, and eventually she decides that, yeah, maybe she should drop this court case. Maybe it's too much. Maybe she should just let it go, and, you know, when Edward's done with the house, he can sell it You know, maybe that's why she wanted him to have it, because, you know, she knew he couldn't take care of himself and he was her biological son. So when they go into the court date, she tells him that she's dropping the case. And he says, well, you know what? I came here to tell you that I don't want to live in that house. That house is old. The neighborhood is for families, not for a single guy who's a musician. I'm selling it. I've already been in touch with a real estate agent, and soon it'll be sold because it's a really sought after neighborhood, and then we can sell it and be done with it. And the lawyers are kind of like, okay. They're like, never have I seen both clients admit defeat so quickly. One other thing that had happened was right before this, Rob had been talking to Susan after she had found everything out about Sylvia, and he said, you know, I'm moving to London soon for my business, because he owns his own business and whatnot. And he's like, you know what, why don't we get a place together? She's like, that's insane. He's like, I know, but why not? Like, you'd be good for me. He's like, I'd be fantastic for you, because he really does bring out a softer, lighter side of her. And he's like, let's just do it. And she says, no, absolutely not. But after the whole court thing, she goes into labor, and the only person around is her brother. And she was like, I do not want you to be there when this child is born. He's like, I don't really want to be there either. But he takes her to the hospital, and eventually her friend Kate shows up, and then Rob shows up, and she tells Rob that, you know what, she will move in with him, and they can be, you know, friends and see what else happens. And it was just kind of sweet to see the process of her opening up to him and letting him in. And eventually she admits to him that she does remember him from college. She just wasn't about to admit it, that he had had such an impact on her. And eventually too, you know, we get this sort of inner dialogue where once her daughter is born, she's looking at her and, you know, she's thinking, I can't imagine looking at my child and then giving them away. But she starts to understand that she's 45 years old. You know, she's not a 17-year-old girl who's terrified and alone and scared. So she's like, maybe I don't have any right to judge Sylvia the way I did it when I first heard the news, you know. So it kind of ends with her thinking, you know, maybe I could forgive her down the road. Anyway, so that's the end of the Cactus. It's kind of funny too, because there's a little blurb here that says even the prickliest cactus has its flower. And just from the cover and everything, I kind of thought he was going to be the cactus, whoever he was, you know. But Susan's the cactus. Anyway, it's a nice read. It's very charming. It's well written. It's great. I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for a nice read that's not too heavy, but definitely has some weight to it. You know, it's not too fluffy, because nobody wants it like that. But it's definitely a lighter read. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, let me know in the comments down below if you've read it, if you plan on reading it. You all have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you guys on Monday with my first paranormal video. I can't wait to share with you guys, and I can't wait to kind of unveil more of the sort of paranormal / true crime content that I'm going to be bringing to my channel. But the book talks will not be going anywhere, I can promise that. Anyway, you guys, I'll see you Monday. Bye.